It's a couple minutes after, and I got a lot to cover, and I don't think I'm going to get it all covered today. So let's go ahead and get started. We're in chapter 26 of Leviticus, and before we start in it, I want us to go back and think about 25 for just a minute. One of the big features of chapter 25 was we learned about the year of Jubilee. And Jubilee was kind of a big reset, is a way to think about it, because one of the favorite phrases in it to me was, every man went back to his inheritance and every man went back to his family. And as we think about that, we would think, well, he got his inheritance back. But it's phrased as he went back to it. And we understand that the inheritance of the land was assigned by tribe and down. And part of the year of Jubilee was that the land was never sold. It was, for lack of a better term, we would say rented. And then every 50 years it would revert back to the ownership of the people that it was granted to. Now, I'm going to throw a wrinkle in that. Who owned the land? Remember, God said, it's mine. So they didn't really own it. So how could it be an inheritance? You scratch your head a little bit. And I think we're looking at kind of two different things in a way, because it was an inheritance of promise to Abraham. And they, as the children of inheritance, received the promise that was to Abraham. If you look over in Deuteronomy chapter 1 for a minute, looking at starting in verse 34. Deuteronomy chapter 1, starting in verse 34. Remember, at the end of the chapter 26 and at the end of chapter 27 of Leviticus, it specifically states that these are the laws that were given at Mount Sinai. So the laws were given early on in the 40 years in the wilderness. Okay? So we need to keep that in mind. Now, what I want to read to you right now has to do with Moses retelling the events when they went into the land of Canaan to spy it out, and then came back and gave their report. So starting in verse 34, he says, "And the Lord heard your words and were angered, and he swore, not one of these men of this evil generation shall see the good land that I swore to give to your fathers, except Caleb, son of I pronounced it one way all of my life, and it seems to be pronounced a different way now. I don't know. Jephunneh, yeah. He shall see it, and to him and to his children I will give the land on which he has trodden, because he has wholly followed the Lord. Even with me, the Lord was angry on your account and said, you shall not go in there. Joshua, son of Nun, who stands before you, he shall enter. Encourage him, for he shall cause Israel to inherit it. And as for your little ones, who you said would become prey, and your children who today have no knowledge of good or evil, they shall go in there. And to them will I give it, and they shall possess it. But as for you, turn and journey into the wilderness, into the direction of the Red Sea." So this is what God was telling them after they said, we can't take it. Our children will become prey. They're too big for us. Now go down to Deuteronomy chapter 12. And I want you to look starting in verse 9 for a second. Deuteronomy chapter 12, starting in verse 9. "For you have not come unto the rest and to the inheritance that the Lord your God is giving you. But when you go over Jordan and live in the land that the Lord your God is giving you to inherit, and when he gives you rest from all your enemies around, so that you live in safety." And it continues. But I wanted to emphasize just a minute this rest. Leviticus has been concentrated, themed. A lot of emphasis has been placed on the Sabbath. We've talked about it over and over and over again. And the Sabbath of the seventh day of every week was a rest. And do you remember why God said they were to do it? Or what it was connected to?
Worshiping God.
Worshiping God, but where did it come from? Where did... On the seventh, God created for 6 days, and on the seventh day, he rested. And so, growing up, I always had this concept of God being tired after creation. And I don't think that's it, because the term rest means to cease. But in context, it can mean to rest in order to recuperate, to cease in order to recuperate. So we have to kind of look to see where. I don't think God had to recuperate. I think he had that power. Darrell Hardy's opinion. So we see this rest, creation and rest theme, this creation and rest theme, this creation and cease theme that keeps coming up and coming up. And then last week we got into the seventh year, or the Sabbath year. Every 7 years they were to let the land rest a year. They weren't to harvest their crops. They weren't to trim their grapevines. They were to let the land rest. And then after seven Sabbath years, the next year, the 50th year, was the year of Jubilee. So there was a lot of this land resting, or them resting, or ceasing from their labors. Now, once again, think these people have just come out of slavery. They've just come out of Egypt. This is a big deal. I think they might think about it a lot of times when we long for retirement, when we don't have to get up and go to work every day. I kind of think that's the way they may have seen it early on. But as time goes on, things change. We come more into a realization of what things are. So we see this theme going along. And it's really interesting, because if you get over into Hebrews chapter 3 and chapter 4, the author of Hebrews makes a very, very interesting argument about this rest. Now, the rest we just read about was specifically talking about, the first passage we read talked about, God was talking about, they're not going to enter into my rest. The second passage says that they will rest from their enemies. In other words, their enemies weren't going to be bothering them anymore. They wouldn't have that problem anymore. The writer of Hebrews takes this concept and says they didn't enter into that rest because of their unbelief. And he says, don't let your unbelief keep you from entering into the rest. Then he goes on, and he's quoting David as he gets into this. Then he says, but David was talking about the rest that was coming, and he was after the children entered into the land. And so he's tying that God's rest into Christ. So there's this rolling theme of the shadow of the Old Testament of the spiritual things, the things that are to come. So I want you to watch for some of that stuff. We're going to see some things that are quite interesting, at least I think they are, in chapter 26. So let's start in the first part of chapter 26. And the first couple of verses are very familiar to us. We've read this over and over again. It's been a very common statement. Ye shall not make idols for yourself. And remember, this is in context of when they get into the land, because the Jubilee year was going to be in the land once they had crossed over into the land. You shall not make idols for yourself, or an erected image or a pillar. You shall not set up a figured stone in your land to bow down to it, for I am the Lord your God, or I am Jehovah your God. Now we've mentioned, well, I'll leave that for just a second. So this is something we're familiar with. We've talked about how as soon as before they could even get the law delivered to them, they had created a golden calf, this type of thing. He's emphasizing over and over and over, you're supposed to be worshiping Jehovah, not an idol. Verse 2, you shall keep my Sabbaths and reverence my sanctuary. I am Jehovah. I am the Lord. What's the difference between the statement, I am Jehovah your God, and I am Jehovah?
King James always says Lord.
Lord.
You and I discussed that one time.
Yeah. It's just because
They feel like they could say Jehovah.
that's right. They did not want to be in the position of possibly taking the Lord's name in vain, of degrading God. So they would not even say his name. It was a sign of respect. And so here, I see these two phrases, they keep coming up connected, and yet they're different. It's almost as if when it says, I am the Lord your God, what does the your God stand for? What does that mean? I'm the one you worship. I am, yes. And then when it says, I am Jehovah, it's his self-existence. It has very little to do with the fact that you worship him, or we worship him, and more to the fact that he is who he is, regardless of whether we worship him or not. And to me, that's a more emphatic statement. And so he's saying, don't bow down to these idols, because you're supposed to be worshiping me. Not me, but God. And you're going to keep my Sabbaths because I told you to, because I'm the one that controls it all. I'm the one that made it. Okay, so, verse 3. If you walk in my statutes and observe my commandments and do them, then. Let's stop there just for a minute. King James says, if you walk in my statutes, or something to that effect, and keep my commandments and do them. What's the difference between the observe and keep and the do them? Because as I grew up in the King James, so when it says keep my commandments and do them, it's almost like, hey, it's saying the same thing. But it's not. He's saying, I want you to observe, I want you to keep my commandments in the front of your mind. And do them. Pay attention to them. So that's the context there of being able to get those three statements together.
Can't you mentally keep something, but not necessarily
Do it, right. You can think about it and not do it. Of course, that would tend to be a rebellious attitude. But he's saying, I want you to be absorbed in my, and that's contrast with something we'll see in a few minutes. He says, this is what I will do if you keep my commandments. Now, once again, this is when we get into the lands. Where are they now? They're in the middle of the wilderness where they keep having to find water. He says, then I will give you rains in their seasons. And the result of that would be the continuation here. And the land shall yield its increase, and the trees shall increase, and the trees of the field shall yield their fruit. I'm used to the King James. I'm reading out of the English Standard, so I get confused at times. But, okay, this is what he's going to give them their rains. Their their crops are going to grow. This is the picture he's drawing. Their trees are going to produce fruit. What kind of picture do you see this making? What was the land called before they got to it? The land of milk and honey. It was a land of plenty, a land of abundance, a land of wonderfulness. That's what he's saying here. Hey, your trees are going to produce fruit. In fact, it's going to be so great that, verse 5, your threshing shall last to the time of the grape harvest, and the grape harvest shall last to the time of the sowing. In other words, they're going to be producing fruit all along. They're going to be always having stuff coming in. Plenty. The concept of having plenty is very much in force here. And if you look at the rest of that verse, and ye shall eat your bread to the full and dwell in your land securely. Now, this is kind of a little bit of a transition here. He says, okay, if you do what I say, you're going to have what you need. You're going to have all the food you can imagine. And you're going to be secure. Now, the secure here is referencing both past and forward as far as this statement goes. The past being, okay, you're going to live secure knowing you're going to have food to eat because it's going to be plenteous. You're also going to be secure because of what's coming next. He says, I will give peace in the land. And if you want to think about what we read to start with, he would give them rest from their enemies. I will give you peace in the land, and you shall lie down, and none shall make you afraid. And I will remove harmful beasts from your land. We don't often think of harmful beasts. Well, yeah, we do. Alligators and boa constrictors. Yeah, we do, but I think of them as thinking of lions and bears that would attack not only them, but their children, their animals. He says, I'm going to take them out of your land. Now, what's the picture he's painting? He says, I'm going to take care of you. You're going to have everything you need. Does that sound familiar to you?
That's what he told him when he took him across the desert.
Yeah, but it's also what we're told about heaven, isn't it? It's a land that there will be no sorrow. A land where all we need is God, and He's there. So we're seeing this type of literary melding. And I will remove the harmful beast from your land. And the sword shall not go through your land. What does that mean? The sword shall not go through your land.
No wars.
What? No invasions. You're not going to have wars. Now, it goes on, which makes you think, well, it doesn't mean there will be nothing that happens, but you're not going to be oppressed by it. Because it goes on to say, you shall chase your enemies and they shall fall before your swords. In fact, so he says, you don't have to worry because I'm going to take care of you. And not only that, but when your enemies do come, they're just going to fall before you. It's going to be taken care of. 5 of you shall chase 100. That's a picture in your mind to think about. 5 of you shall chase 100. And what happened with Gideon? Didn't Gideon do something very much like that? So, he's saying this is 5 of you shall chase 100, and 100 of you shall chase 10,000. Your enemies will fall before your sword. Verse 9, I will turn to you. The King James says, I will have respect unto you. See, that's what respect means, is to turn to. That's the concept. When it says God will turn to them, that means He's looking at them. He's observing them. That's the respect aspect that comes in. Now, we've been taught all our lives, Acts 10, verse 34. So Peter opened his mouth and said, I fully understand that God shows no partiality. Romans 2:11, for God shows no partiality. Deuteronomy 10:17, for the Lord your God is God of gods and Lord of lords, the great, the mighty, the awesome God who is not partial and takes no bribe. So why does God turn to them? Why does He respect them? Why does He look at them like this with favor?
Because they keep His statutes.
Because they're doing what He says. And if you look through the Bible, a good example is Abraham. We don't know Abraham's relationship with God before God told him to go into another country. But God, he found grace in his sight. He found favor in his sight. He was trying to serve God. And I think you see this all throughout the Bible. This is a continuing thing. So I will turn to you and make you fruitful and multiply, and will confirm my covenant to you. Some versions say establish my covenant. The word means to stand up. In other words, I'm going to uphold it. I will keep my covenant. And you shall eat old store long kept, and you shall clear out the old to make way for the new. Okay, he's talking about food here, so what's he say? It's not going to rot in the bins. Your grain's not going to fall apart in the silos. You'll eat long kept food, and you're going to have to get rid of it because of the new stuff that's coming in. That's how plentiful the land is going to be. But I want you to also think of this as a prophecy. Think of this from the standpoint, if you go to the NIV, has an interesting phraseology here. You will have to move it out to make room for the new. If you're talking about food, that makes sense. But what about the next phrase? I will walk among you. I will make my dwelling among you. So he's sitting here saying, hey, you're going to have to move out the old to make room for the new, and I'm going to make my dwelling among you. That's almost like a prophecy of the New Testament, of the church. I don't know that it is, because none of the New Testament quotes it that way, but it makes a lot of sense. To me, anyway. The next phrase, I will make my dwelling among you, and my soul shall not abhor you. What does abhor mean? Hate?
NASB says reject.
Reject? Despise? The term that comes to mind for me is loathe. And that comes to my mind because of the children of Israel. Remember what they said when they wanted quail and then got more so much they couldn't stand it? They loathed it. That's the way we are sometimes. We get so much, so we're so tired of this. We have leftovers and we can't eat it for 3 meals in a row. We loathe it. We're tired of it. We can't stand it anymore. And take that to a little bit further extreme, and that's what he's talking about here. He said, I'm going to make my dwelling in it, and I'm not going to get tired of it. I'm not going to abhor you. I'm going to keep you. I will walk among you and will be your God, and you shall be my people. And that's why I like to tie that. I look at that and read it and tie back to the other phrase, thinking about, is it talking about moving out the Old Testament and bringing in the New? It fits. I don't know if it actually is or not. And then verse 13, excuse me. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, that ye should not be their slaves. And I have broken the bars of your yoke and made you to walk erect. So here's God painting them a picture. He says, you've had yokes around your necks and on your shoulder. You've been bent over carrying a heavy load. I brought you out of Egypt and I broke those bars. You're now standing up straight. That's who God is. He says, you will worship me because of that. Okay, covenants. He's talking about the old laws he's given here. The last chapter, the chapters before, he's been reviewing some of these laws. And in this chapter, he says, okay, here's the promises if you keep my commandments, and here's the punishments if you don't. And that's just like we have contracts today. If you do these things, hey, you have a contract for your house where you're paying your mortgage. If you pay your mortgage in 15 years, 30 years, however long the contract is, if you meet the contract, you get the deed to the mortgage. That's the blessing you get. If you don't meet it, then you get penalized. Your credit rating gets dinged. You lose what you've put into the house. You just all kinds of punishments, if you want to call it. That's a common thing in contracts. So here, God says, if you will not listen to me and will not do all of these commandments, if you spurn my statutes, and if your soul abhors my rules, there's that word again. Can you imagine us getting tired of doing good? Loathing, it's time to go to church again. It's time to go to work. How many times have you heard people talk about that? It's true, we do that. He says, if your souls abhor my rules, so that you will not do all my commandments, but break my covenant, then I will do this to you. Yes, sir.
You know, I was thinking it's almost like us. You know, when you go to a job, you're trying to make a good impression to make sure we keep that job. Then after a while, we become complacent. You know, we get loathing, and we start taking things for granted.
That's true. Taking God for granted is a dangerous thing. So, yes. So he says, I will visit you with panic. Has anybody, most of us probably have, if we haven't experienced or had someone we know experienced a panic attack, we've heard about it. Other versions say sudden fear. The concept is paralyzed with fear almost. We get that. He says, I want to give you where unease. Now, contrast this with the things that he said he would give them. What did he say? I'm going to give you rest. I'm going to give you peace. I'm going to give you all you need. Nope. If you don't do it, you're going to be panicked. You're going to be, what's next? I will visit you with panic, with wasting disease and fever that consume the eyes and make the heart ache. We don't know what these diseases were. There's lots of people talking about different things that could have been. But once again, the picture that's being drawn here is utter hopelessness. Here, I'm panicked. I can't do anything. I don't know what to do next. Things are just crashing in on me. The world is crashing in on me. Oh, wasting disease. No matter what I do, I'm getting weaker and weaker. And the people around me are. There's some people that think that the consume the eyes means that they're looking at what's happening around them, and it's just heartbreaking. Others think that it's a disease of the eyes that caused blindness and was very contagious. But once again, the picture here is hopelessness. He says, I'm going to take away what you have. You're going to be in as bad or worse shape than you were in Egypt, and make the heartache. Can you imagine if you were in this circumstance that is being pictured here and seeing your children suffer? The heartache. And ye shall sow your seed in vain, for your enemies shall eat it. Once again, contrasting to the blessings, where you're going to have so much you can't really harvest it in and no place to put it because your barns are full. You're going to have to get rid of the old stuff first. You're going to sow, but you're not going to get to reap it because your enemies will eat it. I will set my face against you. Now, contrast that. I will turn to you. I will set my face against you. That's the difference there. Those are being contrast. I will respect you and I will not respect you. You shall be struck down before your enemies. Those who hate you shall rule over you, and you shall flee when none pursues. That's, this is just, the scary part about this is it all happened. Every one of these things happened. And if, in spite of this, you will not listen to me, then I will discipline you again sevenfold for your sins. Now, this is an important phrase here. Why is God doing this? Because he's punishing them because they're bad deeds? He's doing it because he wants them to listen to him. He's doing it because he wants to bring them back to him. All of these things he's doing is so they will turn to him and keep his word. So they will become the people they need to be. and I will break the pride of your power. When you think, if you think of their mindset when they're in their land and they've inherited this, we don't know for sure what their mindset was, but we can look at ours. We have our homes, we have our jobs, we have the ability to feed ourselves, to take care of those around us, and when we have problems, others help us. We have a security net. God said, nope, you're not going to have anything. I'm going to break the power of the pride of your power. You're not going to have any power. And I will make your heavens like iron and your earth like bronze. I read that phrase and I said, what in the world is he talking about? Your heaven like iron and your earth like bronze. And so I went and did some research, and everybody seems to think that he's talking about the sky is going to be like iron. There's not going to be any water in it. It's going to be hot. It's going to be a drought. And the ground is going to be so hard, it's going to be like bronze. You're not going to be able to grow anything. And once again, this was an agrarian society. And what wasn't agrarian was they were raising sheep, goats, cattle. If you're not growing grass, you're not going to be able to do that. And your strength shall be spent in vain, for your land shall not yield its increase, and the trees of the land shall not yield their fruit. Then, if you walk contrary to me and will not listen to me, I will continue striking you sevenfold for your sins. And I will let loose the wild beasts against you. Remember, he said he was going to keep the wild beasts out of the land. He says, you're not going to be able to feed yourself. You're going to be just despair. And on top of that, you're still not listening to me, so I'm going to send the wild beasts in, which shall bereave you of your children and destroy your livestock and make you few in number, so that your roads shall be deserted. And if by this discipline you are not turned to me, but walk contrary to me, then I also will walk contrary to you. And I myself will strike you sevenfold for your sins. And I will be sworn to bring a sword upon you that shall execute vengeance for the covenant. I was talking before the class, they went into slavery in Babylon. This is what happened. Why? Because they wouldn't listen to him, because they were contrary to God. And if you gather within your cities, I will send a pestilence among you. Picture this. They're being invaded. The armies are coming through. They gather in their walled cities. And God sends a pestilence so they get disease. And he says, you can't even hide in your walled cities. There's not going to be anywhere you can go. Once again, think of us and the promises and what we've been told. If we don't obey God, there's nowhere we're going to be able to hide either. And you shall be delivered into the hand of your enemy. When I break your supply of bread, 10 women shall break bread in a single oven, and shall dole out your bread again by weight, and you shall eat and not be satisfied. Picture here being that in good times, they could make as much bread as they want. They had their own ovens. They could, it was easy. Hey, women are going to be standing around waiting to use the oven. They're going to make one loaf of bread, and they're going to dole out a piece here and a piece here and a piece here, and that's all you get. But if in spite of this, you will not listen to me, but walk contrary to me, then I will walk contrary to you in fury. Another phrase there is in wrath, in anger. He says, it's not going to be good. And I myself will discipline you sevenfold for your sins. You shall eat the flesh of your sons, and you shall eat the flesh of your daughters. Remember me saying everything in here happened? That happened. We even have a record of it. If you look over in, and I have to look up my reference here. If you look over in 2 Kings chapter 6, the king is walking in a courtyard, and a woman comes up to him and wants him to judge and make this other one bring her son forth, because they got together and said, today we can eat my son and tomorrow we can eat yours. And so today we boiled my son and ate him. And then I went to her the next day and she had hid her son from him. Make her bring it out so we can eat him. That's how bad things got. All because they would not listen to God. Verse 30. And I will destroy your high places and cut down your incense altars and cast your dead bodies upon the dead bodies of your idols. Wait a minute. Were they supposed to have high places? Were they supposed to have idols? Hey, you will have gone so far, and now I'm going to prove to you they're not gods. They're not going to be able to help you, and my soul will abhor you. That's another scary phrase. And I will lay your cities in waste and make your sanctuaries desolate, and I will not smell your pleasing aromas, that's the sacrifices, and I myself will devastate the land, so that your enemies who settle in it shall be appalled by it. Some versions say amazed. It's just so devastating. Why did they live here? Nobody would live in this concept. That's the picture he's drawing here. And I will scatter you among the nations, and I will unsheath the sword after you, and your land shall become a desolation, and your cities shall be laid waste. Okay, verse 34. This ties it back to chapter 25. Then shall the land enjoy its Sabbaths as long as it lies desolate. While you are in your enemy's land, then the land shall rest and shall enjoy its Sabbaths. And as long as it lies desolate, it shall have rest, and the rest that it did not have on your Sabbaths when you were dwelling in it. Last week we mentioned the fact that we don't have a record of them actually observing the Jubilee years. We don't know that they didn't, and some may have, but we don't have a record of it. But here he's saying, all those years that you were supposed to let the land rest, every seventh year and then on the year of Jubilee, it's going to rest now. It's going to get its rest. It's my land. It's going to happen. As for those of you who are left, I will send faintness into their hearts in the lands of your enemies. A sound of a driven leaf shall put them to flight. Have you ever woken up at night or something and heard a sound and worried about it? What was that? What was that sound? Or been camping out and heard a sound. Was that a bear? You're going to hear a leaf fall and you're going to run from it. And they shall flee as one flees from the sword, and they shall fall when none pursues. They shall stumble over one another as if to escape a sword, though none pursues. And you shall have no power to stand before your enemies. Now, just as a thought, and it just hit me, and I can't remember where it is, what the event was, but I remember there was one event in the Old Testament where there was an army up against Israel, and in the middle of the night, even though Israel wasn't attacking them, they heard sounds and killed each other and fled, and I don't remember where it was or what it was, if anybody does mention it. But Gideon, that wasn't Gideon, was it?
Was it when they besieged Jerusalem? I forget.
I don't remember, but it's there. So we can look it up and figure it out. But doesn't that sound like that? He's saying, just like I can do it to Egypt, just like I can do it to you. and I will if you don't keep my commandments. And you shall have no power to stand before your enemies, and you shall perish among the nations, and the land of your enemies shall eat you up. And those of you who are left shall rot away in your enemies' lands because of their iniquities, and also because of the iniquities of their father, they shall rot away with them. And then the big flag comes, the really good thing here. But if they confess their iniquity and the iniquities of their fathers and their treachery that they committed against me. What was the treachery that they committed against God? Oh, we'll do your word. We'll keep your commandments. No, he says, that's treachery. But if they confess their iniquity and the iniquity of their fathers and their treachery that they committed against me, and also in walking contrary to me, so that I walked contrary to them, and brought them into the land of their enemies, if then their uncircumcised heart is humbled. That's an interesting phrase in the Old Testament. We think about it in the New Testament, uncircumcised heart. But in the Old Testament, then if their uncircumcised heart is humbled and they make amends for their iniquity, then I will remember my covenant with Jacob, and I will remember my covenant with Isaac, and my covenant with Abraham, and I will remember the land. But the land shall be abandoned by them and enjoy its Sabbaths. I'm going to remind you of that again. While it lies desolate without them, and they shall make amends for their iniquity because they spurned my rules and their soul abhorred my statutes. Yet for all of that, when they are in the land of their enemies, I will not spurn them. Neither will I abhor them so as to destroy them utterly and break my covenant with them. For I am the Lord their God. That is such an awesome phrase. He said he abhorred them, but he says, I want to abhor you to the point where I'm going to break my covenant. I'm not going to abhor you. I'm not going to loathe you to the point where I won't do what I've said I will do. But for their sake, I will remember the covenant of their fathers, whom I brought out of the land of Egypt in the sight of the nations, that I might be their God. I am Jehovah. Almost makes chills go down your back, at least mine. It's like, wow. We went through this section that seemed to be forever about all the bad things. But the beginning is the promises and the end is the promises. That's only if we disobey, only if they disobey. Verse 46, and we'll be through for the day. And these are the statutes and rules and laws that the Lord made between himself and the people of Israel through Moses on Mount Sinai. One more chapter and then we're through. So 2 more weeks of class. Maybe 1, but I'm thinking it'll be 2. Thank you for your attention today and your comments.
You know, the sad thing about all this, they still continue to disobey God.
And,
The whole rest of the Old Testament, all the prophets were constantly reminding them what they've done.
doesn't it sound a lot like today?
Yes.
And that's the big point to me.